You're listening to News from the Underground on Resistance Radio. resistradio.com. Alright, so let me get into the news. So of course, a big story that's just come out in the last couple of hours is about this guy who is apparently facing extradition to the US. I'm sure you've just read about this, but isn't it absolutely terrible? I mean, this guy, I think he's 23 years old, and he set up this website when he was a 19-year-old student, and it was a website called tvshack.com, and basically it contained lots of different links to sites where you could find pirated films and pirated TV shows. There wasn't actually any copyrighted material hosted on his website. The servers for the website were based in the Netherlands, but this guy is being prosecuted under US copyright law, and he could face extradition to the US, where if found guilty of the crime that he's supposedly committed, even though as far as I can see there hasn't actually been a crime committed, he could face 10 years in prison. You know, absolutely disgraceful. Especially, you know, as a crime hadn't been committed in Britain. You know, there is no crime in Britain if you have a website that simply features links to other sites containing copyrighted material. But because of a 2003 treaty that was signed between Britain and the US, basically now the US can just demand the extradition of people that they accuse of committing copyright offences. And as I say, this wasn't a crime in Britain, what this young guy is accused of. And in fact, there was a case just last year, very similar to this, where the case was thrown out of court by a British judge because he said this isn't a crime in Britain. But because of some fairly obscure sounding reason, which is that this TV Shack website you actually had to register for, and apparently registered users could post links on the site to other pirate sites. Apparently the judge or the prosecutor has argued successfully that that makes this guy Richard O'Dwyer more responsible than it would if that hadn't been the case. If the site had been as this site had been in the case that was thrown out last year. So this guy is it's been very unfortunate, really. And it gets even worse than that when you look into it. I mean, the reason that the US can actually do this is because of the address, the .com address. Let me just read out a paragraph from an article that was in The Guardian from last July, which talks about the anti-piracy body in the US who is behind this, which gives the reason why it's possible for the US to prosecute people in Britain even though a crime hasn't been committed in Britain. As long as a website's address ends in .com or .net, if it's implicated in the spread of pirated US-made films, TV or other media, it's a legitimate target to be closed down or targeted for prosecution. While these web addresses are traditionally seen as global, all their connections are routed through VeriSign, an internet infrastructure company based in Virginia, which the agency believes is sufficient to seek a US prosecution. So yeah, .com or .net. If you've got a website ending in .com or .net, which I have, resistradio.com, then you stand the risk of being prosecuted. You know, if I was to put links on resistradio.com to pirated material or to websites containing pirated material, then potentially, you know, I could be extradited to the US, and it's damn scary. I'll tell you that much, damn scary. So yes, I mean, I'm sure, you know, this guy's going to appeal, and I mean, I'd personally be surprised if he was extradited. I mean, I think we're all aware of the case of Gary McKinnon, the guy who's accused of hacking into Pentagon computer systems, and he claims it was because he was searching for evidence of alien. I don't know the full details, to be honest. Something to do with aliens, anyway, or like alien technology that the US government was trying to keep quiet. I mean, you know, this guy has subsequently been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and I think he's been going through this for like a decade now. And can you imagine the stress of that, of having that hanging over you? You know, not knowing whether at any moment you could be deported to the US, away from home. You know, absolutely appalling. So yeah, I mean, it's just really scary, and you know, this is just going to be the start, because we all are aware of the SOPA legislation that is being forced through at the moment in the US, and you know, when that's enacted, I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of these kinds of cases. And you know, this is pretty personal, because some of us, you know, upload copyrighted material, or we work with copyrighted material, and what could that leave us open to? You know, who knows? And the irony is, actually, another story that's just come out in the last couple of hours, which is kind of analogous, is about the Duchess of York. This is an article from The Telegraph. Duchess of York evades extradition over TV row. This is relating to Sarah, Duchess of York, who apparently in 2008 filmed a TV program for ITV, in which she went undercover in a Turkish orphanage and kind of exposed ill treatment of children there. And yeah, Turkey have basically made a request to the British Home Office to extradite her, because she was charged with criminal offences in Turkey relating to violating the privacy of 5 children when she was in this state-run orphanage, and that's an offence which apparently carries a prison sentence of up to 22.5 years. But no, the Home Office have turned down this request for her extradition. Well, I mean, you know, no surprise there. She's connected to royalty. She's rich and influential. So, of course, she's not going to be extradited to a foreign country to face a trial for, you know, things that they accuse her of. But some young student, he will possibly be extradited. You know, the Home Office hasn't leapt to his defence and refused the US demand for his extradition. So, you know, kind of a interesting analogy there, or interesting comparison between the two cases. Yes, what else has been happening this week? Well, actually, before I get into more news from this week, I'd like to refer you to an article that I wrote at the beginning of the week, which is kind of a follow-on from the show that I did last week, which, as you might remember, was about the alleged, well, or the convicted murderers of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence. Now, in last week's show, I basically discussed all of the many questions relating to the conviction of 2 men, Gary Dobson and David Norris, for Stephen Lawrence's murder. And, you know, I gave my personal opinion, which is that I don't believe these 2 men were guilty of murder. I mean, that was kind of especially so in the case of Gary Dobson. And I subsequently read an article which again was very alarming, and, you know, showed how there really is no justice how the British justice system is, a sham really. It doesn't really provide justice. And I wrote an article about this, which you can find on the resistradio.com website in the articles section. And the article that I read about that prompted me to write my own article was about the fact that senior figures in the probation service had said that unless Dobson and Norris confess to the crime, unless they admit to their guilt in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, then they could well serve many more years beyond their actual sentences, which were 14 and 15 years in prison. And, whether you think that Dobson and Norris were guilty or not, this is very worrying in my opinion, that this is standard policy, which it does sound to be from reading the article that I read. It appears to be standard policy that for people who've committed, or people who've been convicted rather, of committing a serious crime such as murder or rape, for example, it's policy that unless they confess to having committed the crime, unless they admit their guilt, then they could well serve many years beyond the sentences that they were handed down by the judge. And how disturbing is that? I mean, it's totally Orwellian, like something out of 1984, because basically it assumes that every single person in a British prison who has been convicted of a serious crime, murder or rape, it assumes that they are guilty and that the British justice system is 100% accurate all of the time, which, as I don't need to point out, is totally absurd, totally unrealistic. This is one of the reasons why the death penalty was abolished in Britain and many other countries around the world, because of the possibility that miscarriages of justice happen. They do happen. And there's also of course been the many cases where police corruption has led to guilty verdicts. Some of the ones that I named in the article were for example Winston Silcott, who was accused of the murder of a police officer. Also the Irish guys who were framed for bombings, the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, and one that I mentioned last week of course was a more recent case called the Cardiff 3, three men who were framed for the murder of a young woman in Cardiff. Yeah, so there's undoubtedly innocent people languishing in prison, Undoubtedly there are people who have been given a life sentence who didn't commit the crime, but the British state says unless they confess their guilt, then they might well serve more time in prison. I mean, what a terrible situation that would be to be in. It would be bad enough being sent down for life or for a long time for a crime that you didn't commit, but then you face the situation where to be released you would actually have to confess to the crime that you didn't commit. I mean, it's totally crazy. It's a very good way for the state to also justify convictions, even if those convictions are highly dubious, which I think in the case of Dobson and Norris they actually are. So yeah, please do check out that article on the resistradio.com website. What I'd like to get into now, another fairly depressing story, I'm afraid. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I deal with, really. Depressing stories. I did say a while ago that I was going to try and inject more upbeat stories into the program or into my videos, but it's kind of difficult really in the world that we live in. So yeah, mainly sort of negative stories, but you know, what can you do? So what I'd like to talk about now is the British complicity in torture, relating to a couple of cases. One relating to the rendition of supposed terrorists who actually are now not terrorists, because one of the guys is now chief of operations in the new Libyan government. And a story that came out this week was relating to the fact that Jack Straw is going to be questioned about this guy's rendition and torture at the hands of Gaddafi and the Gaddafi regime, because of course Britain was friends with Gaddafi and the Gaddafi regime up until our takeover of that country. You know, bridges had been built between Gaddafi. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown were quite happy to meet with him and shake his hand. There were all kinds of oil deals being set up. The SAS were even sent to Libya the year before the NATO illegal attack on that country to train Gaddafi's forces, which is just completely nuts. 1 year the SAS are there training the supposedly brutal, evil forces of Gaddafi, and the next year they're there to help the rebels to fight the very forces that they'd helped to train the year before. And of course, you know, there's the documented fact about all of the arms deals that went on between Britain and between Libya, all of the weaponry that Britain supplied to Gaddafi and to his repressive forces. So yeah, anyway, at this time when these deals were being made, when Gaddafi was shaking hands with his good chum Blair in the desert, the British security services, or MI6, were helping Gaddafi's forces to basically kidnap people that they accused of being Islamic extremists, Islamic terrorists, and kidnapping them and their families, including their children, and in one case a pregnant wife of one of the men, taking them to a prison, and then just basically torturing them there for years. I'll just find the details about the guys who were allegedly rendered. Yes, Sami al-Sadi and Abdul Hakim Belhaj. So it's Belhaj who is now senior military commander in the new Libyan government. He was living in Beijing, and he was actually trying to travel to the UK because he was claiming asylum there. And what happened was he was kidnapped en route to the UK and taken to Libya, where he was held in prisons for 6 years, and he alleges he underwent all manner of torture, and that the Brits were fully complicit in his torture, and that there were British agents present there when he was tortured. And yes, Jack Straw is going to face questions over this torture. Obviously he was Foreign Secretary at the time this was going on, so anything that happened in terms of MI6 was basically under his watch. Of course, he's claimed that it wasn't his responsibility and that he didn't know what was going on, which seems like a fairly feeble excuse to me, because he was head, or well, he was foreign secretary, so it was ultimately his responsibility. Tony Blair, of course, has also denied any responsibility. even though Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the former head of MI6, is on the record as stating, quote, "It was a political decision for the government to cooperate with Libya on Islamist terrorism." So the former head of MI6 is very strongly implying there that these ministers, did indeed know about the torture that was going on. I mean, that should be a surprise to nobody. These guys were responsible for the illegal invasion of Iraq, which has resulted in the wide-scale devastation that we see in that country, and the innumerable people who have been killed during that illegal invasion. So it should come as a surprise to nobody that these characters like Straw and Blair were authorizing torture. But it's just interesting as well how one decade people like this Delhaj character can be the enemy, can be accused of being Al-Qaeda, and then the very next decade they're our friends again, because it suits the West's agenda. So who knows what's going to happen because of this inquiry, this questioning of Jack Straw. I mean, I really don't think anything's going to come of it. It's probably going to be a whitewash as usual. These guys should be in court for the Iraq War, never mind complicity and torture. You could argue that this is pretty small stuff, really, when you look at the grand scheme of things and what these guys were responsible for. The wide-scale murder that they were behind. But anyway, so there's quite a few of these investigations happening at the moment. One is this Libya one that I've just talked about, which is called Operation. Let's just have a look. I've got a list of them here. Oh, that investigation hasn't actually got a name, but there are a couple of other investigations going on into other cases where MI5, MI6 and the British government have been accused of being complicit in torture. So one is Operation Hinton. This is the Scotland Yard investigation into MI5's interrogation of Binyam Mohammed. Now, Binyam Mohammed was the British citizen. I believe he was born in Ethiopia, but he was a British citizen, and he was one of these guys who was basically captured in Afghanistan. He claims he was there because he was trying to kick a drug habit, I believe. So he was one of these people that was swept up in Afghanistan post 9/11 with the invasion of that country, whisked off to Guantanamo Bay, where he spent several years in Guantanamo Bay, where he was tortured in sort of all manner of ways, sleep deprivation, but also direct physical torture. He alleges that his testicles were cut with sharp blades and stuff like that. Pretty awful stuff. So anyway, yes, the British security services are accused of being complicit in this because they were fully aware of what the US were up to, and there were even British intelligence agents present when he was being tortured in Morocco, where he'd been rendered to prior to his incarceration in Guantanamo Bay. And this is pretty interesting because this is a case that the British government, or the last British government, the Labour Party, had really tried to cover up and to hide. There's one character who was especially responsible for this attempt to cover up British complicity in the torture of Binyam Mohammed, and that's David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary in the last Labour government. Of course, David Miliband, the brother of the current head of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband. Yes, he consistently tried to prevent the courts from finding out what the Brits had actually known about this torture of Binyam Mohammed, which ties in with a story that I actually meant to mention in last week's show, but I forgot, or I ran out of time, which I'll just briefly mention now because I think it's pretty important. I'll just see if I can find the story. This was from last Friday, last Friday's Guardian. Government should stop state secrets being aired in court, says spy watchdog. Britain's Intelligence and Security Committee pushes for statutory presumption against disclosure of intelligence material. The watchdog for Britain's spies is lobbying the government to introduce sweeping curbs that could prevent UK courts from examining intelligence material. Proposals by the Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC, comprising parliamentarians appointed by the Prime Minister, brought to light by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, go beyond measures proposed by the government, which the ISC says do not go far enough. The committee claims that its proposed new powers would protect UK citizens by ensuring that intelligence obtained from foreign agencies, such as the CIA, was never publicly disclosed. Such material, it says, saves British lives. Of course, that's the reason that they always give for these measures that are going to impact on justice and impact on our rights. It's in our own interest. Well, of course it's not. So yeah, anyway, I mean, what this means is that basically British intelligence material can't be aired in court anymore, which is incredibly worrying. I mean, we already saw, for example, during the 7/7 inquest, and the fact that MI5 were incredibly reluctant to provide any information about what they knew, even though all of the evidence points to them being, at least grossly incompetent, if not, directly involved in setting up 7/7. I mean, if you haven't seen Keelan's last video, Wide Shut UK, then check that out. That details some of this information. I think basically they did eventually manage to get an MI5 officer in court, but he was completely anonymous. He gave his evidence without having to disclose who he was. No one actually knows who he was. And yes, possibly now they might not even have to do that. They might not even have to submit to questioning by British courts. So pretty disturbing stuff. And this is exactly what David Miliband was trying to do. He was trying to prevent the disclosure of information which was highly incriminating for the British government and for the security services in terms of the torture of Binyam Mohammed. It's quite interesting. David Miliband, of course, a Jewish man, as is his brother, and did a bit of research today. Found a good article called David Miliband's Murky Past. This is a website called redress.cc, which I can recommend you to check out. That's redress, REDRESS.cc, a political website. And yeah, this article details the information about Miliband trying to keep this hush-hush. Apparently he also tried to change the law on universal jurisdiction. I don't know a great deal about this, but this article claims that he was kind of very much pushing for a change to the law on universal jurisdiction. He was pushing hard within Whitehall for this, according to the Jewish Chronicle. And this article alleges that Miliband put much effort into the subject so that suspected Israeli war criminals could avoid justice once landing in the UK. I've not looked into that myself yet, but that's definitely worthy of some more research. I only just read this article a couple of hours ago. And then it also talks about David Miliband's name appearing on quite an interesting website. Apparently there was a website existing up until a day before the British general election, which was on the 5th of May 2010. So this was a website called the Israeli Hasbara site. Now if you're not aware of what Hasbara is, well, I'll just pull up the Wikipedia entry about Hasbara. Okay, this is under the public diplomacy Israel in Wikipedia. Public diplomacy in Israel, also Hasbara, refers to public relations efforts to disseminate information about Israel. The term is used by the Israeli government and its supporters to describe efforts to explain government policies and promote Israel in the face of what they consider negative press, or delegitimation. Finally got it out. About Israel around the world. Others view Hasbara as a euphemism for propaganda. So it's basically Israeli public relations / propaganda to try and paint Israel in a positive light. You know, we've all heard about the things that Israel have been up to. I mean, they've got a whole squads of people working on the internet, for example, to try and put Israel in a better light than it's perceived. They've got people working on Wikipedia itself, for example. I'm surprised they've not had a better go at this entry, to be honest. I'm surprised they've let the euphemism for propaganda sentence on this page stay there. But yeah, they've got whole squads of people who go around changing Wikipedia entries to make Israel seem, you know, in a better light than it's perceived. They've got people going on YouTube, leaving, you know, positive comments or comments critical of videos that criticize Israel or Israeli policies. So Israeli propaganda, basically. And what this article says is that this Israeli Hasbara site that went offline the day before the British general election, yeah, David Miliband's name was on this list. And anyway, the PDF that he links to does indeed show David Miliband's name on this list. The Israel Hasbara Committee, which was established in 2001. You know, obviously a website regarding Israel and trying to put Israel in a positive light. And there's a whole list of people. I mean, there's a massive list of people, but his name is on that list, David Miliband. Between David Mayer Levy and David P. Farrer. I don't know who those two are, but other Hasbara authors, apparently. So yeah, it's quite interesting there. David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary, a Jewish man who tried to keep secret British complicity in the torture of alleged Muslim terrorists. Interesting stuff. And it also provides me with a kind of a handy link to the next story that I'd like to talk about, which is the back to the Fox Werity affair, which I've done a few videos about, done a couple of shows on. If you didn't catch those shows, I'll just recap what this is about. This was about Liam Fox, who was the Conservative Defence Secretary up until recently, when he was forced to resign after it came to light basically that he'd been working with an unelected friend of his called Adam Werity, who was basically travelling the globe masquerading as an official government representative when he in fact wasn't. He was giving out business cards describing himself as Liam Fox's advisor, and he was very much giving people the impression that he was representing the British government. All kinds of dubious meetings were going on at pro-Israel conferences, for example. They had dinner in Israel and met members of the Mossad there, and Fox and Werity were members. In fact, Fox set up the Atlantic Bridge, a supposed charity which actually had to stop calling itself a charity because the Charity Commission investigated it and said, what you're doing isn't charitable. It was basically a front group for neocons. Lots of the neocons from the US were connected to the Atlantic Bridge. Henry Kissinger was also involved, you know, loads of dodgy people like that. William Hague as well. I mean, it was a bridge between the neocons in the US and the neocons in Britain, who are now in power. And Werity was being funded by very rich businessmen. I think 3 out of the 5 people that were funding his trips around the globe to set up these business contacts, and where he presumably was, you know, trying to agitate for an attack on Iran, which is what this looks like, a conspiracy to push for the attack on Iran that, you know, very much seems like it's going to happen at some point. Yeah, 3 of those people were very influential Israeli businessmen connected to such organisations as BICOM, which is the British-Israeli, I can't remember what BICOM stands for actually, but it's basically an Israeli pressure group who puts pressure on the British government to support Israel and engages in this Hasbara, this pro-Israeli propaganda. So anyway, yes, the story that I was wanting to get to here was relating to Werity and his links with David Miliband, who I've just been talking about. I did that video, of course, recently about Matthew Gold, who's the British ambassador to Israel. It's unprecedented that this role is now being filled by a Jewish individual, Matthew Gold, who is a self-professed Zionist. Now, Matthew Gold was the private secretary for David Miliband when David Miliband was in power, and it came to light that he was also present at some of these meetings between Adam Werity and Liam Fox and other individuals representing the Israeli intelligence services. But yes, this also brings Miliband into the picture. This was an article from The Independent last Sunday. Werity met Miliband official. Adam Werity, Liam Fox's former advisor, whose activities led to the Defence Secretary's resignation, held official talks with a senior civil servant at the Foreign Office when Labour was in power. It emerged last night. Details released under the Freedom of Information Act show that Mr. Werity met Matthew Gold, Principal Private Secretary to David Miliband, when he was Foreign Secretary on the 8th of September 2009. The disclosure is the first link between Mr. Werity and the Labour government. It was not included in a report by Sir Gus O'Donnell, the Cabinet Secretary, into the shadowy advisor's contacts with government figures at the height of the Fox affair last October. Mr. Gold is now ambassador to Israel and met Werity on 8 occasions, including a dinner for Dr. Fox when he was Defence Secretary and senior Israeli intelligence officials. So this was released under a Freedom of Information request from Craig Murray, who I've talked about in a previous show. So yeah, links here between the last Labour government and David Miliband and his private secretary, And the Conservatives, who are now in power, obviously Liam Fox was Defence Secretary. You've got William Hague, who was a member of the Atlantic Bridge. You know, it's just basically, there's no difference between the Labour government and the Conservative government, you know, which we all know, but it's very interesting to see these Zionist links connecting both governments. And you know, it's incredibly dangerous as well, because it's pretty clear that these meetings were all about, as I just said, pushing for an attack on Iran. You know, these secretive meetings taking place outside of British politics were pretty clearly an attempt to support Israel and to pressure for military action against Iran. You know, we already see the sanctions against Iran, which is financial terrorism, isn't it? The value of the Iranian currency dropped 10% in 1 week because of the sanctions that were being carried out by the West on its central banks. And these sanctions are hitting the everyday people in Iran. You know, whatever you might think of Ahmadinejad and the Iranian regime, the people certainly don't deserve to suffer for that. But it's the people who are going to be suffering because of these sanctions. You know, and some people speculate this is part of the agenda. You know, this is part of a plan to make the people within Iran, the citizens, so, you know, pissed off with the government that they rise up themselves and overthrow this regime, which is very clear the West wants to get rid of. You know, it's quite clear that there's a covert war happening against Iran. There hasn't been overt military action yet, but you know, it's very obvious that this covert war is being carried out by the Anglo-American Israeli alliance. You know, another story that just came out today was detailing the funeral of this nuclear scientist who was murdered earlier in the week, which has already been mentioned, of course, in other resistance radio shows. But you know, it's an important story. This nuclear scientist just murdered, you know, travelling through, I think it was in Tehran, in a car, and these assassins pull up on motorbikes, attach magnetic bombs to his car, and murder him. I'll just pull that story up because, of course, he's only the latest scientist to be murdered. There's quite a list of these scientists now who are being offed, and it's clearly by the Mossad, you know, supported by the Anglo-Americans. So yeah, this guy was a professor, a university professor, Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, 32. He was a director of the Natanz uranium enrichment plant in central Iran, and that was Wednesday that he was murdered. Yes, and let me just briefly mention all of the other ones that have been killed recently as well. January 2010, another professor was killed in exactly the same style. A motorcycle exploded. A remote control bomb attached to a motorcycle exploded near his car. November 2010, 2 nuclear scientists were killed and some others were wounded. July 2011, another one was killed by motorcycle riding gunmen. It's just disgraceful, you know. This is outright terrorism. I mean, how the West or Israel can get away with doing things like this and then claiming to have the moral high ground is just really beyond beyond understanding, really. If you remember that plot that was alleged about Iran, that they were supposedly plotting to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador when he was in the US. That came out a few months ago. You know, it was a sting operation, and there was actually no evidence provided to link the Iranian regime with this plot. But I'm sure you remember the fuss that was made about that. I mean, can you imagine if Iran successfully carried out an assassination like has been happening in their country? If some scientists were blown up in Washington, for example, and Iran were behind it, I mean, that would be the pretext for, you know, a full-on war, wouldn't it, with Iran? But when Israel or when the West do it, oh well, that's just fine, you know. This is all part of containing Iran because they're such a threat, because they want nuclear power. You know, the double standards are really absurd. You know, these aren't the only signs of this covert war that's happening. There are also, you know, blasts at military sites as well in Iran. So there's not a hot war going on with Iran at the moment, but there's very obviously a cold war happening. You know, bombings, assassinations, and yeah, dangerous times. We've got the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously a hot spot at the moment, with the US and Iran both posturing, you know, showing their military might. Iran threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, the US Fifth Fleet parked nearby in Bahrain. You know, another thing I was going to mention today was about the West double standards, was relating to the fact that David Cameron is in Saudi Arabia today, meeting King Abdullah, because apparently the trade links between Saudi Arabia and Britain are, you know, pretty big. Let me just pull that story up so I can get the figures in terms of the trade deals between Britain and Saudi Arabia. But why I mention this story is because, you know, Britain and the US are the first to start crying about human rights abuses, but Saudi Arabia, which is a country David Cameron is visiting today, because those trade deals are worth £15 billion a year to Britain, and Saudi investment in the UK is worth more than £62 billion. You know, it's funny, isn't it, how David Cameron is there schmoozing with King Abdullah, and if you look at Saudi Arabia's human rights record, well, it's pretty appalling, really, in all kinds of different ways. I mean, you know, there are literally no rights for women in that country. There are no rights at all for gay people, for example. In fact, homosexuality is illegal and is punishable by death. Torture routinely happens. The legal system is totally corrupt. But do you hear our Western leaders talking about that? No, of course not, because that country is very important in terms of oil and trade. And yeah, it's the same in Bahrain with the US and the Fifth Fleet. You know, last year there were all kinds of repressive measures going on because the people were trying to stage an Egypt-style revolution in Bahrain, and the government there cracked down on the protesters in very much the same way as Mubarak did. But do we hear about Bahrain being evil and a new regime having to be put in place there? No, of course not, because they're happy for the US to have their Fifth Fleet stationed there. So we're never going to hear these things about Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. The things that we heard about Libya. You know, the excuses that were given for the takeover of that sovereign nation and for the murder of Gaddafi. Yes, double standard.